All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order. Can I get an adoption of the agenda?
I move to adopt the agenda as presented.
Second?
All right, motion and second. All those in favor, raise your hand and say aye. Aye. Motion passes. All right, we have item 2.01, program evaluations.
So if you recall, back in June of 2024 at our board retreat, we talked a little bit about program evaluations. We have a board policy that lines out, I think, a dozen different program evaluations. And we talked about what we would ask our staff to do and come back with proposals to you on what they're seeing for their objectives and measurables. So this is going to be something that Dr. Barger is going to lead through. Maybe Dr. Schultz will step up for one of them as well. But they've been working with their staff. Most of them are in Dr. Barger's world. And get feedback from you, and if we're good, we'll move forward. If not, we'll give it another rinse cycle and come back again. So Dr. Barger has a very large piece of paper in front of you, so she'll be using this document. It doesn't have all the pieces that's in what I showed you in the summer, because those other pieces would be filled out as they fill out the actual program evaluation when it's their time. So Dr. Barger?
Yep, absolutely. So we are guided by board policy IM with this work, and so the small font at the very top of page 1 is just board policy IM lifted and placed there for us to reference. And you can see that board policy IM requires every 2 years a review of those 12 pieces there, and actually it's really 11 because the 12th is renewed annually at the school level, and then 13 kind of, because curriculum is reviewed when we approve our new curriculum pieces. But for the most part, it is that federal title programs down through that professional development. So as Dr. Buck mentioned, given the conversation at summer work session and the idea of shifting into program evaluation, that is just that true evaluation of a program by setting a criteria on the front end, determining what that criteria will be, and then reporting out whether that criteria was met in terms of successful program evaluation. That was the approach to the work that we did. So I gathered all of the leaders in the district who are responsible for these areas. We worked through how we thought this would be best laid out. They identified when in the year was best, May, April, June, and then we toggled between odd years and even years to make things as even as possible. And then what we really tried to do is ensure that we could have a very clear alignment between objectives and something quantifiable and measurable. Because while we all really like to celebrate our programs, we believe a program evaluation should be just that, a program evaluation. And there are lots of other ways that we'll get to celebrate our programs. So format, just to anchor yourself, you can see that that first column just describes the program. So for example, this first one is, and I will not go through each thing on each thing, we're going to focus on 2 columns in particular, but the first column is the program or department, just the category. The second is really the position responsible. I didn't put individuals' names there. We're going to keep position titles there for the longevity of the document. That third column is really the overarching goals of the program or department. So that answers, why does this program or department exist? So for example, for federal programs, and it's interesting that this is the first because it's kind of the most unique because it's really guided by the federal government, right? The goal of federal title programs is to effectively use title funds in compliant ways to supplement services so that the district can provide additional services to students and staff. That's the reason in general the federal programs department exists. We've got the number of students impacted for each program. In this particular situation, again, a little unique in comparison to others because we listed out each of the titles and how much, how many kids were involved. Now these are the next 2 columns where I really hope to focus in our sharing through work session, which is the idea of the objectives and the measurables, success or metrics. And we've tried to do a one-to-one left to right alignment. So for example, the objective number 1 of federal programs is to provide supplemental support and resources and staffing to increase student achievement. So then if you move over to the 1 in measurable successes and metrics, you'll see that we've lifted out of the CSIP the academic success goal that at least 50% of the students in each subgroup, including our all students subgroup, will reach their identified NWEA fall to spring growth goal. The idea being that we can equate, that we can show that we have academic achievement aligned with our objective. Again, federal programs is a little unique. It becomes more clear as we get into some of the other categories. To provide staff development really comes out of our Title II. And that really then the feedback from that would be that our DESE staff culture and climate survey would show that at least 80% favorable responses in our staff support and resources category, because the goal of those title funds is to provide resources and support for our staff. And then the third objective of federal programs is to provide supplemental support to increase student well-being. That specifically falls into Title IV. And then again, the DESE Student Culture and Climate Student Survey would show above the state average in favorable responses rate in the school climate category. So that would be how that would work out, right? That we would have what is the program, what's the overarching goal, the number of students impacted, and a left to right objective versus measurable success. So what I'd like to do is just work my way through each of them, particularly those two columns, and then open it up for questions or feedback as we get to the end, if that works for the group. So if you flip the big page, that takes us to special services and is obviously managed by the Executive Director of Special Services under IDEA. And the objectives are listed to provide specially designed instruction in the least restrictive environment at or above the state average, measured by over 50% of the students' IEPs reflect being inside the regular classroom 80% or more of the time based on IEP audits and DESE profile data. The second objective would be that students are making progress on their IEP goals, measured by at least 90% of the students making progress on their IEP goals. 3, maintaining compliance with state and federal regulations, which would be measured via file reviews, both internal and external, and that they would reflect a 94% or more compliance in terms of IEP compliance. And that we would engage students and families specifically in the area of special services, and that the measurement would be that at least 3 family engagement opportunities would be offered per school specific to families with students on IEPs. The next program would be that of Diploma Plus or CTE, which actually we've sort of rebranded. If you go up to board policy, it is Career Technical Education. We're trying to bring our new language into the program evaluation, but it is the same. Obviously, our Director of Career Ed helped coordinate these, objectives being having available for students and teachers a comprehensive set of business partnerships within the Diploma Plus program to be measured by a minimum of 250 partner engagements per school year, to provide student opportunities through real-world learning, career technical education, and market value assets attainment. And that would be measured through the district having a minimum of 1,600 CTE concentrators, which is students who have taken enough CTE coursework together to become a concentrator in a specific area, and a minimum of 200 real-world activities. And then the third piece there in terms of objective is to enhance career curriculum for your planning with individual career and academic plans. So in other words, the ICAP. Are our students using their ICAP? Used to be known as the 4-year plan for those of us who've been around for a while. And that would be measured by at least 90% of the students in grades 8 through 12 having completed their ICAP, and at least 90% participation in the graduate and post-graduation surveys. Moving into the program of gifted education, the goal would be screening and identification processes, yielding a gifted program serving 4 to 5% of the district's eligible grade levels, as measured by at least 4% of the enrolled LSR students K-12 would be identified as meeting the DESE criteria for gifted. And that 4% goal, that's a typo, that 4% goal should align with that state criteria. So we need to do a little work there. And the second piece would be that curriculum documents and instructional opportunities for gifted courses are aligned with the Missouri Gifted Outcomes. And essentially the measurement there would be that 90% or more of the Missouri Gifted Outcomes are represented in formalized LSR7 curriculum documents, so that when we look at the gifted curriculum, we see those gifted outcomes embedded. The next area in Board Policy IM that has a program evaluation is a relatively dated term that we don't use too often, which is programs for at-risk students. But essentially that is usually an evaluation of Summit Ridge Academy and other alternative programming. So when we look at objectives, we were talking about students graduating through either the Missouri Options Program or through credits obtained through an alternative setting. Or students transitioning back to their home school with the opportunity to be successful. And this is one of the places where we don't have a number-to-number alignment, because really the measurement of both of those things is in that at least 80% of the students enrolled in at-risk education programs will successfully graduate from the program through credit acquisition, or by completing the Missouri Options Program, or will transition back to the School of Residence. Obviously, the outcomes of those programs are designed to be what the student needs when the student needs, so measuring that has some options there. That brings us to early childhood programs. Parents as teachers, keep in mind that that includes all of our early childhood programs, and that the goal would be, and that includes Head Start, parents as teachers, early childhood special education, title programming, and our new pre-K program. And the goal is to identify and serve students in the community who meet the criteria for LSR7 early childhood programs, and that would be measured via 90% of our available spots being filled. To provide academic, social, emotional, and behavioral instruction and support to students in ages birth through 5 to prepare them for kindergarten. And there are a variety of measures there, but specifically the percent, again, given different programming, there are some different measures. The percentage of ECSE, that's early childhood special education, children who exit the program functioning at age expectations as compared to the state will remain 95% or higher. And the desired results developmental profile will indicate that the majority of pre-K students are emerging toward or mastering the next developmental level when it comes to the 10 Missouri early learning standards that we assess. The next would be to evaluate and identify early childhood students who meet eligibility criteria for special education services and to develop individual education programs or IEPs to meet their needs. And that would be evaluated or measured via early childhood diagnostic teams, reviewing and evaluating at least 75 students per semester. And then finally, parents as teachers will provide the screening and support for children within the program, and that would be measured by parents as teachers having completed developmental screenings for 85% or more of our enrolled families. The next program is student health services. Our nurses and our health rooms. Health Services Department will manage emergency preparedness and ensure that each of the members of their staff is fully equipped to respond effectively to any emergency situation, including medical emergencies, natural disasters, communicable diseases, outbreaks, mass casualty events. And we're going to measure that by basically quantifying the number of services being provided. We would imagine that if that was being done successfully, we would manage approximately 70,000 health room visits, 17,000 medical procedures, and 17 to 20 911 calls annually. The second objective for the Health Services Department would be to provide professional development opportunities to ensure that the staff remains competent and confident in their ability to provide services. And the feedback or measurable success for that would be that at least 80% of staff will express satisfaction on the department staff satisfaction survey following those professional development opportunities. And then the third piece would be that the Health Services Department would support students and families in accessing health resources and expand options for health screenings through collaboration with community health organizations and partners. And that measurement would be that 90% or more of the R7 students who opt in to participate in health screenings will be screened, and 100% of those who are referred will receive notification and will be provided resources for community assistance. Moving into library media resources, the objective is to provide and promote a varied, high-quality collection that supports both academic and personal growth, fostering literacy and a love for reading. We did talk a little bit about how hard it is to measure a love for reading, but essentially the idea here is to quantify what's available. Circulation will remain near 625,000 checkouts annually, and in engagement activities focused on literacy will involve at least 85% of our students each year collectively. The second objective would be to create, embed, and implement library curriculum focused on inquiry, critical thinking across multiple disciplines to equip students with research skills and ethical information practices. And that would be measured by research and media literacy components will be embedded in at least 10 courses across multiple grade levels, and that 85% of students will participate in library-led research and media literacy lessons each year. The third objective will be maintain welcome library spaces and provide collaborative support for students and staff, and that would be measured by each school library hosting at least 2 promotional events for students and 2 professional development opportunities for staff. Moving to the area of technology, this is led by the Executive Director of Technology, and the objective would be to maintain a high-performing technology department as measured by the Center for Internet Security Control's self-assessment tool. And that would be measured by the annual assessment score on a set of nationally recognized technology information security best practice standards would exceed the score of 40 annually. And the last row is that of professional development. to continuously provide research-based professional learning that equips educators with strategies to improve student engagement, achievement, and equity in learning, to be measured by favorable responses from participants in post-session surveys regarding the effectiveness of professional learning and its impact will be at or above 80%. And then to create opportunities for educators to learn from one another, share best practices, and engage in meaningful professional learning communities. And that would be measured by our DESE staff culture and climate survey, showing at least 80% favorable responses in that staff support and resources category. So while that's a lot all at once, it kind of gives you a sense of programmatically how we're tackling it. I will also tell you that each of these areas would also, in their own sense, be working on continuous improvement. This is a very different document than our CSIP, right? Our CSIP is about how do we always get better and move forward. This is about how do we know we are fulfilling the expectations of our programs. And so those two things, we have CSIP goals for many of these departments. Some align and some are stretch goals, but this is about measuring how we know we are managing effective programs and reporting out accordingly. So most certainly open to questions. I think Dr. Buck can help with some process questions, knowing that he kind of brought the process to us at work session, but also happy to answer questions based on the information the leaders have provided here.
And so if you remember back in June, board policy IM says we're going to evaluate these 12 programs, but many times our program evaluation looks like a show and tell of action steps. So we're trying to move away from action steps. So I think Dr. Barger and all the folks who you see listed in that second column who've worked on this over the course of the school year to come forward with what they believe would be wise objectives and how they could show you whether they met them or not. So at this time, I think we'd want to answer questions, and then after that, get thoughts of, are you okay with what's going on with our staff suggesting these?
Sorry, I heard you hit the button, but it did not light up. Do you want to try again? Okay, it's not working. Do you want to, we can just have open discussion if that's easier instead of having to.
Should she just be 13?
Oh, yeah,
She can just be this one.
go ahead.
I think we've established that I was going to say something. I like the format of this document. This is a very familiar format to me because this is kind of how curriculum would be laid out, right? And so I remember the conversation in June, but I'll be real honest with you, I was still somewhat in shock that I had a chair at this table in June. So I don't know that I really remember the entirety of what it looked like before, but this to me is like, this is what I'm used to, so I like this.
Board Member Miller?
I would just ditto what Stacy said. I really enjoy this format. I think this is helpful. It's easy to read. It's easy to understand. I like that. First of all, I like this paper. How do you do this? All the special
We
paper.
probably can get you some
all
special
the special
paper.
at central office. But yeah, I just like how it's laid out. I think it's very well done, and it's easy to read. It's easy to understand. I really like it. So thank you for all your work on this.
Well, lots of people worked on it. but-
Thank you for everybody's work on this.
Vice President Esley? Did you have something? Sure. Okay. All right. So one of the questions that kind of originated in this conversation, I think, was kind of going to a little bit of a deeper level. But one of the pieces of feedback that we've heard a lot is that, people watch our public meetings and they always see us approving new programs. They see us approving new contracts, but they never hear us say, well, we got rid of that one because it didn't work. So in this, I know this is looking at over a higher overarching level at some of our bigger programs, but if you had, say, a resource, I'll just pick on one because I know it's actually a good one. Lexia is a software that people use for literacy, okay? So if we determined that that program was no longer meeting our student needs, how would we know that? I know that's kind of at a deeper level than this, but does that somehow incorporate into this document, or do you use a similar guideline when you're evaluating those type of resources?
So if you open up the link inside the agenda item, This has more sections than what you see in front of you. So this is the section that they were creating, but there's other sections in here that they would be reporting out to when they do a program evaluation. And the second to last section is changes made, follow up from the prior program evaluation, where they say, we added this, we took away this is what we believe happened because of it. So there will be a section for that, but that's part of analysis. Here, they're just trying to say, this is what the objectives and how we would measure those objectives. But yes, they will be doing that in this new format.
I do also think, as we think through that this purchasing process cycle helps us a great deal with that process as well. Most of the time when we adopt a resource, we adopt it for X number of years, or like a year with the opportunity to renew for maybe 1 or 2 years. And at the end of that time, then we're in a position of absolutely having to evaluate, right? Because we're going to either have to put out for an RFP again or make another substantial purchase. So yeah, absolutely there is the internal review of that and would come in that place from an external review, but it's a little different than what is listed in IM, you're right.
If I think back to, so let's just use one product we don't use anymore, is Panorama. And here it talks about a climate survey that's state created. Actually, I think MU created it for the state. The state asked them to do so. We utilize that survey with our students and staff, and that replaced Panorama. So in that particular program evaluation, if this was in place that year, the changes made would be saying, we cease using Panorama on this date and started using the new state exemplar given to us at this date, and here are the results. So that you would see that reflected in this evaluation form.
Thank you. Vice President Eslick?
Well, first of all, thank you for putting this together. I will echo the sentiments of others. I think this is really great, and I know a lot of work went into this, so thank you and everyone at SLC for working hard on this. I did have a similar question to President Foley, but I think we kind of covered it because there was kind of like the other on this first page about curriculum, which that really was kind of the genesis of this whole topic of conversation. Was I think we really started with the academic outcomes from the programs that we are constantly approving and adding and making sure that those are actually getting the results that we want. So I'm glad to hear that that's going to be something that we get to the opportunity, well, the rest of you get the opportunity to view in the future. So, but I did have a couple of questions. So on the special services section here, you know, when I know we're talking high level, but this is just a question about, I guess, how we can evaluate or see the real impact in the classroom for, like, our staff, for example. Like, one of the things that I hear from some of our staff that have to manage a lot of student IEPs, you know, oftentimes they have more students with IEPs than students who don't have IEPs, and that becomes really challenging for them to try to balance that. So I don't know if there's a place to see how that impacts, like, the staff, or like the amount of staff we have in the room to support the number of IEPs, or, you know, how that falls into this mix, because I know we've just focused on, you know, meeting the IEP goals. I don't know if there's anything else that we can see as a board that kind of looks at the staff side of that. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I think it becomes really difficult to try to meet all of that expectation with the resources the staff have in the room sometimes, and I don't know how we evaluate that to make sure, you know, if this teacher has 20 students and 18 of them have IEPs, do they have enough staff, and how does that impact being able to accomplish this, and how that fits into evaluating that program?
Yeah, I think that there is, you know, some difficulty there also in that, you know, we might have X number of students with IEPs, and we might have X number of students who are EL, and we might have X number of students who have high poverty needs. But certainly we know that when there are concentrations of students who have high needs or may need different levels of support in place, that might need extra staffing. We work through guideposts that are established through the district so that we have a sense of caseload. We have a sense of once a classroom or a grade level or a school has a certain level of need, we have the evaluation conversation about non-allocated FTE. So I think really what might be Like where that might be the best conversation is a review or a conversation with the board about thinking through guideposts or staffing or just in general, more so than directly tied to that IEP piece. But Dr. Black, I don't want to speak for
So
you.
I was going to see if Dr. Kenny and Dr. Mathis, if you want to come up and talk about how you equalize out as best you can in a regular classroom, because obviously self-contained, it is probably going to be 100% IEP because it's a self-contained situation, like our classrooms. Or some of our medically fragile classrooms. But when we're talking reg ed, we should not have 18 out of 20 IEPs. In fact, we should be nowhere close to that. So if you guys can speak to that piece.
Well, we also have CWC, so that's the other piece
That's what I'm
of
trying to
that.
get to. And even
So-
that won't get to 18 out of 20.
Yeah, Heather, Dr. Kenny can speak to the elementary classroom assignments for sure, but at the secondary level, we kind of use some guidelines and recommendations working with administrators at the middle and high schools and our special education facilitators who are helping to build out the master schedule. We look at those course requests and we set kind of some parameters for when we need to max out a modified curriculum class, which would only be special education students and no general education students included. In a CWC class, the recommendation is that would be about a third of the population. The rest of it should be randomized classroom assignment of general education students. So there are also no guarantees that students who also have a 504 or EL needs might be also assigned to that CWC class, but the parameters are really we should be at about a third of that class size having IEPs in that co-teaching environment.
It looks a little bit different at the elementary level. We try to look at all the needs of the students in the grade level and then balance those between classrooms. And so the SPED facilitators help with that. Sometimes it's principals that help with that. Sometimes it's the coordinators, sometimes it's the teachers. Just it kind of depends on who's in the grade level and how we need to balance the needs to kind of be across the grade level.
Okay.
There
Sorry.
are times where we have a heavier population in one grade level at a building, just that number of students happen to have IEPs in that grade level, and it's rare, but we have had a couple of individual building discussions where there have been a grade level where there were a higher number than what we would typically see of the overall population, and so sometimes it is a little bit harder to balance those out, but we do try to balance those out amongst the classes.
Gotcha. So, I mean, it sounds like you kind of review that to make sure that somebody isn't kind of absorbing more challenging workload so that it doesn't, the entire class doesn't suffer as far as like not having more attention from the staff.
And
So
that's-
it doesn't overburden them.
And that's easier at a bigger elementary, like Prairie View has 600 kids, so it's easier to do that because you have a bigger population spread out. It's more challenging at our couple buildings that are below 300 because they might have two sections. And so if you have just a grade level going through that has significantly higher than our 10% IEP rate, 11% IEP rate that we have district-wide, there's less choices to spread it out. So that's where it becomes challenging. You get more ups and downs by grade level the smaller you get. The bigger buildings that tend to level out over time.
Yeah, I would say the vocal educators that I've heard from have largely been elementary. And the 18 out of 20 was totally just a made-up number. So I wasn't being realistic about that. But anyway, okay, so it might not be like the best fit there as far as how we know what kind of juggling is happening. And it sounds more like kind of a staffing conversation that would be then more of a program review for that particular. Is that kind of more accurate?
I would say it's accurate, and also we don't want to put negative pressures on trying to identify kids, because if we put a pressure on you can't have more than a certain percent in a grade level in a small building, that puts pressure to not identify kids, and we're bound by federal law to find
Right.
every single kid that qualifies.
I would be more in favor of saying, okay, if you have more kids, then we need to go to add more staff and approve that, than say, don't identify kids, of course.
So going to staffing, so this is a 5-year program we're in the middle of right now. So almost all of our non-allocateds in Stacy's world for next year. We have, other than 2 math interventionists, and I think there's 1 other position, everything else is in special education. There is a formula based on class size, depending on what kind of classes you have, and also caseloads, depending on what type of teacher you're teaching. And so there's a formula, we fill it out, and then we have a 5-year plan to make sure we're in compliance with what the DESI formula does. It's a lot more complicated than just saying you have to have 27 kids or smaller in this grade level. It takes into account the type of teaching and type of classroom setting, your number of kids, and the caseload you have.
Well, and I think it's fair to say too that you have to think about, like, not every kid has the same needs. So like, and with IEPs, you know, like for instance, Charlie needs an IEP for dyslexia, but not every kid, you know, every kid has different needs for their IEP. So that could also determine where the need lies for the staff as well.
I had one more question, not related to this, if anybody else had anything. Thank you very much. I appreciate the information. No, you had something. Do you want to chime in?
The only thing I was going to say was, I taught CWC up until my last day of work. And they're right, it randomly, you might have a semester that's really heavy. And then the next semester it's not. And part of that is because these kids have so many program options, especially by the time they're junior or senior, that to get the schedule to work, to get the things that they have to have, but yet the things that we want them to be able to have access to as well, it's just and I always looked at it like, well, this was a challenging semester. Next semester is going to be not so challenging, or vice versa. And it kind of, that's just kind of the ebb and flow of it. So, but that's all I was just going to add.
Thank you. Appreciate the perspective. So I had just moving on to a different section. I was looking at the programs for at-risk students, and it's not so much about that program, but it more was kind of like a follow-on question of when we look at how maybe it's not a program question at all, but I know we talk about at-risk students at the secondary level because that's where we have the programs. But I also think about our students who might be transitional, kind of potentially, what is the word for it? Our homeless population that I can't remember. McKinney-Vento. There we go. Homeless or foster, or those kids who are not in secondary who don't fall into those programs, but you might consider at risk. Where do they fit in our program evaluation for those students that we're making sure that they're getting taken care of, and that whatever that program is also working for students outside of secondary in those in those categories?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good question. We really looked at that kind of at risk as we had typically thought about it, which was alternative school sort of setting. So really that sort of then would become, one of the categories that's not listed here, or if we wanted to, I think one of the hard parts with that at risk, really, I'd like to see that get changed and really talk more about alternative settings for education, since that's what we typically measure. But there are lots of ways to be an at-risk learner, having trauma in your life, having, there's just lots of ways that you might be more at risk than others. So, we could certainly provide updates through each program, or program updates to the board on Fridays. But you're right, this is really crafted through that lens of alternative school setting, just because historically that's what it has been. I guess that would be up to us and you as a board to talk about how you want those updates. Do you want, through Friday update, an update on McKinney-Vento now and then, and what's in that category? Again, it's kind of hard. That's why that at-risk word, a lot of districts have kind of changed it informally to like at potential and, things like that. But really, we have just left it as is because we really just usually categorize that as the alternative school settings.
It's an interesting question, and I hadn't thought about this.
No,
So
I hadn't either.
McKinney-Vento is an unfunded mandate, right? But we do identify students are homeless, and if you're homeless for 2 days, you get marked for the entire year, which is very different than if you're homeless for months and months and months. So there's different levels of needs, and what we do is we provide needs to the students on a case-by-case basis, but I don't know how to make a metric around that off the top of my head. So let me think about that one. It's a good question.
I was just curious where those students fell and if it was part of that or how we considered that. But it'd really be up to the rest of these individuals up here to decide how they want to do that. But I was just more curious, so thank you.
I do think that that's something worth following up on and figuring out how we can look at that, especially when we look at the populations of, free and reduced lunch students, and we take that into consideration when we're looking at academic achievement, looking at McKinney-Vento and kind of the impact that has might be another good metric that we can use for those breakdowns.
So one thing that's causing me to think, again, we said not the CSIP, and it wouldn't specifically get to McKinney-Vento, but it would certainly get to the other subgroups, including free and reduced lunch. We have those academic goals in the CSIP that would then break down by each of the subgroups. So we definitely can get it broken down by the larger subgroups, but for those students who happen to be served by McKinney-Vento, it would be a much tighter look. And we might think about how and when we do that, also given the end size of that group, we want to be cautious that we're not sharing too much information for a small group.
Thank you. Board Member Haley?
Thank you. And again, I'll echo the format. I like it very well. It's easy to read, easy to understand. My question is kind of twofold, Dr. Barger.
Yep.
I like the objectives section, and I like the measurable metrics that we have there. My question, the first question I have is, if we drill down another level in this document, can we see the specific plans that you have in order to achieve these goals? And then what does your feedback loop look like, where you're going to get feedback and adjust your plan if you're not hitting your goals? Does that make sense?
Yeah, and to some degree, that's really aligned to those CSIP action steps. So I think if we asked these department leaders, how are you going to ensure that you get this? They're going to say, well, we're going to do what we do, and we're going to continue through our school improvement process through the action steps in the CSIP. I think they would push us back to the CSIP as their improvement plan to drive towards this.
Okay, so you believe that organically we can achieve these goals just following our CSIP?
I do.
Okay, so if we're not achieving our goals, what's that look like? Is there a feedback loop that says, hey, we're not hitting these goals and we need to do something different?
Yep, so when we talk about those columns that aren't on this chart but are in the tab, which is what is the credit, what are we gonna do something different, that's where we have to come and be accountable essentially here to say, okay, we think these are the goals. We follow our CSIP, we do the school improvement work we believe is right for our department. We believe this is going to be the way we feel like we can tell you we have an effective program in this category. And if we miss that mark, then the next column is, okay, we've missed the mark, here's our data, here are the changes we're going to make to ensure that to attempt to make sure that we make the mark the next time.
How frequently will we expect to see something along those lines? I mean, are we gonna do that like once a year, or like at the end of the year? We're gonna do it twice a year,
By board policy, it's by every other year. It's so if you look at board policy IM, it's listed up here on the top. We have these 12, and they're supposed to come back to you every other year.
So we evaluate the programs every other year?
Yes.
Okay,
And,
thank you.
and that gives them time, if we do make change, for the change to take effect to see was a change successful or not.
So we won't see a report except every other year, is that what we're saying?
We can ask for data anytime. I can share data with you anytime, but the program evaluation by board policy is every other year.
Okay, thank you.
All right, do we have any other questions or comments at this time?
Okay, we'll
Thank you.
begin to operationalize this. We'll figure that out. I think that's the next piece. I'll fix that 5% to 4% that I found as I was reading out loud, and I found one place where it says we all make it the district, but other than that, and I will try to fix page breaks, but other than that, we'll use this as our operational document. We'll get the schedule scheduled, and I will reiterate from Dr. Buck, most certainly out of academic services, if any board member wants any data about any program at any time, we will be happy to get you any level of detail of that data. That needs to be a very clear message. This is just that very formal process of bringing the program evaluation and making it meaningful, and maybe a little bit less of just like a demo.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your work on this and for the team that collaborated to put this together. This is really great. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, with that, our work session is adjourned.